for coming along tonight to this Bright Blue event entitled A Zero-Sum Game, Greening and Heating Homes Affordably. I've been asked by the organisers of Bright Blue to point out that if you are so inclined and wish to engage in a little bit of tweeting, that you can do so with the hashtag Bright Blue and CPC 21. And of course, this event is also sponsored by Citizens Vice, so we're very grateful to them. Just to let you know as well, this event is being live streamed, so if you have any objections to that, now's the time to look away or leave. But I can't imagine, right, not you, definitely not you, otherwise I really will be empty-handed up here. For those who don't know, my name's Lewis Goodall. I'm policy editor at Newsnight, a title which covers all manner of sins, usually what my editor wants me to do on that given day. But one of the areas it definitely does involve, I suppose, is energy policy. And we are joined, or we will be joined, already a star-studded panel, but we've got an even more star-studded panel to come when they turn up, including Lord Martin Callanan, Minister for Business, Energy and Corporate Responsibility at BEIS. He was, of course, before that Minister of State at DEXU, and before that a long-standing Conservative MEP. Won't be able to say that for very much longer about many people. Gillian Cooper, at the end there, Head of Energy Policy at Citizens Vice. Bim Afolami, who's the PPS to the Foreign Secretary, member of the Regulatory Select Committee and Public Accounts Committee. Patrick Hall, who's a Senior Research Fellow at Bright Blue. And we'll also have Josh Buckland, who is a partner at Flint at the moment, but of course lastly an energy special advisor at BEIS, and has written recently a special pamphlet on this very issue. And obviously this is a very, very germane issue, not only at this conference, but it will be in the conferences to come and in the years to come, because clearly not only is green energy and greening all a very significant part of the Prime Minister's agenda, but it's clearly also going to be potentially a very significant issue both within the Conservative Party and the Conservative family, but also, of course, outside the Conservative Party as well. A few questions we want to try and get through today. Everyone agrees that we need to green the economy, green our home energy supply. There is, of course, far less agreement about how that is to be achieved and who will pay for it. And hopefully our panellists might be able to inform us and give us a few of those ideas this evening. Should we be waiting around for things like hydrogen? Should we be getting on with it at the moment? Why are we still today building new homes which aren't properly insulated and with gas boilers? Why is the new home standard? Is it appropriate that it should be coming in 2025? Why not earlier? What role do developers have in all of this, particularly when construction isn't necessarily or isn't always at the standard that it should be? And how can we really try, are consumers aware that this is coming? And if so, and if they're not, how can they be made to be, and how can that support be generated, and what government can do in that? So let's get underway. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for about 5 minutes, so we've got lots of time for questions. So Bim, why don't you get us underway?
Great. Well, thank you, Lewis. Thank you for that introduction. It's this, I think, when we talk about climate change and the environment and this whole subject, which I've noticed at this conference has just so many panels are on the environment. It's probably almost the most popular topic at this conference, which says something in and of itself. But when we think of greening and heating people's homes, this is where I think politically the rubber really hits the road on this subject, because it's one thing to talk in abstract about carbon emissions, which no one can really see, and it's usually dealing with things that people don't really think about, whether it be power stations or even cars. People can get their head around switching to an electric away from a petrol or diesel car. But when you start saying to people, the way you heat your home may have to change, it becomes very personal, therefore it's politically very dangerous. And I think how we handle this issue may have more of an impact politically than almost anything else in this whole agenda. So I think it's very important. There are two things that we should bear in mind, not just as a party, but broadly as policymakers on this subject. The first is that we need to make sure that the vast majority of people, not just the poorest, but the vast majority of people, are not left out of pocket by whatever the government policy towards this is over the coming years. I think that to not do that would be politically disastrous and would undermine our whole efforts in this entire area, because there are many people who are probably not in this room, though they may be, who are much more sceptical than the Prime Minister and the government about this whole agenda, and will use this, if approached wrongly, to attack the whole premise of the government getting to net zero by 2050. So I think the first lodestar is the vast majority of people we should make sure they are not out of pocket as a result of this transition. The second point is, what does this transition look like? And look, a lot of people like talking about hydrogen. There'll be people who have studied it in more detail than I. I personally, when it comes to home heating, I think hydrogen, we have to be very careful. I know there's pilots going on to look at this very thing, and I hope that they are successful. But we have to be very careful about hydrogen, because of its instability as a gas makes it potentially difficult to do in a mass market way in domestic residential homes. There are all sorts of different technologies, but the key thing is that underpinning all of these technologies is a clear government target set far enough ahead of time that it allows the private sector to invest and prepare, but short term enough that it will really make a difference for the net zero target, so that the private sector can have the proper signal to invest in the new innovative ways that we all know are greener ways of heating everybody's home. Now, the last point I want to make is just simply on insulation. And the difficulty with insulation, I lose track of the number of people who say things like, when I speak at events, they say, well, what the government needs to do is they just need to pay to insulate everybody's house. We say, okay, fine. How would that work exactly? So that means, by the way, you've got all the skills, all those people have the skills to do it. Someone knocks on the door or sends you a letter, right, I'm from the government, I'm coming to insulate your home, I'm going to come and rip up, that plastering you've just done, getting rid of all that, I'm going to come and do it, and then I'll leave you. Now, you say that, and by the way, this is assuming that you're not having to pay for any of this, right? Someone comes and does that. Now, I know quite a lot of people that would react a bit strongly about that. They say, hold on, I don't want you to do that there in my home. I don't want you to do this. So I'm not saying that some of this won't need to happen, but I do think we're going to have to be incredibly careful of how we handle it. And the last point I'd like to make is around new homes. On new homes, we need to move faster than 2025. Now, I think by 2050, I read this stat somewhere, or if I haven't read it, maybe it'll become true if I say it enough, which is in 2050, 98% of the buildings that will be around have already been built. Is that right? Right, yeah, I'm sure it is. So if that's the case, if we can't even do the 2%, what hope do we have with the 98? On new homes, we need to be not just a decent standard, we need to be setting incredibly high standards for new house builders, and even if it costs them a bit more in the short term, and they will scream and they will shout, over a pretty quick period of time, I think the costs will reduce, and that is almost the first step we need to be taking. I think 2025 is probably too far. We should bring that forward a couple of years.
Thanks, Bim. Let's move on now. He's here to Lord Martin Callanan, who, as I say, is Minister for Business, Energy and Corporate Responsibility at BEIS.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lewis. I'm not sure what's been said so far, but let me summarise where we are.
We're mainly judging your lateness for the Parliament.
Yeah, apologies for that. This is probably one of the, as I think Bim was just saying, one of the biggest political challenges that it faces us as a government. It doesn't get that much publicity, but it's something that will cost us an enormous amount of money over the next 15 to 20 years. Estimates vary, but there are something like 28 million buildings in the UK, responsible for 30% of our emissions, that we now have a legal obligation to decarbonise by 2050. The Climate Change Committee said it will cost about £250 billion, which is a frighteningly large number. As Ronald Reagan said, a billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. And the question, of course, politically, is if we accept we have a legal obligation to do this, even if the costs come down, which I think they will over the next few years, it's still going to cost a lot. And the question, of course, is who pays? From the point of view of government, our priorities are Firstly, fabric first. That is, as I think Ben was saying, this is the most important thing that we can do, is that whatever form of low carbon heating system we eventually go for, and we'll talk about some of them, I suspect, in the course of this debate, but insulating homes, making them more energy efficient has to be a good thing to do, and it's certainly no regrets strategy. In terms of what low carbon heating options there are, from a government point of view, there are basically three that we see as forming the basis of policy. Obviously, heat pumps, the much maligned technology, have the advantage of they already exist now, they're already there, they're a proven technology, they work, but of course they're expensive. They're widely used on the continent, but actually not so much so far in the UK. Secondly, hydrogen. I'm kind of a little bit of a hydrogen skeptic at the moment. I think it has great potential, but at the moment, and I'm hoping that our great entrepreneurs and scientists will provide solutions here, but at the moment it's quite expensive to produce. And we produced our hydrogen strategy a few weeks ago, which set ourselves a target of producing 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen, not no carbon hydrogen, by 2030, which will be a mixture of blue and green hydrogen, and we'll be consulting shortly on a market mechanism to help to incentivize that. Heat pumps, I'm sure there'll be further debate about them, but we are shortly coming forward with the Clean Heat grant, the results of that consultation, which will be introduced from April next year, which will be a straight, simple grant payment paid to installers to incentivise the market of that. The Prime Minister has set us a target of getting up to 600,000 heat pump installations by 2028. We currently install about 30,000, so you can see there's a massive increase, 20-fold increase, in fact, in the space of 6 or 7 years, which would be a huge challenge. But we do have a good track record in this. I mean, if you look at the cost of solar panels have come down by 95% in the last 10 years. The cost of wind turbines have come down by almost 50% in the last 10 years. So incentivizing the market, providing initial seed corn financing helps to drive, provide the right policy signals, provides the right atmosphere in which businesses can innovate and can help to move people to the newer technologies. Let me say a word about the importance, I think Bim also said it, of bringing consumers with us. I've just done another fringe on a similar subject, and one of the energy company suppliers was saying, smart meters are a good thing. I agree, they are a good thing. I'm responsible for it, and they are rolling them out well, and we're installing hundreds of thousands a month. He wants them made compulsory. Now, I think that's a retrograde step. I think my post bag is already full enough of people complaining about them without trying to make them compulsory. And demonstrating the benefit, taking people with us, showing them how the new technology works, how it can be an advantage to them. Yes, incentivizing them, and companies are already starting to roll out tariffs which are only available to people that have smart meters, is a much better way of doing it than the government passing a law, passing a regulation to say that you must have a smart meter installed in your home. Of course, the challenge we concentrate on the challenge of decarbonising domestic houses, and that's difficult enough, and we're taking action through the private rented sector, through local authority homes, and we will shortly be consulting on a mechanism to incentivise owner-occupiers as well, all whilst protecting those on lower incomes. I was screaming at the TV, as I'm sure a lot of you do first, when I was watching all of the coverage of these idiots gluing themselves to the M25 on an Insulate Britain campaign. But fundamentally, we're already doing a huge amount in this space. We spent something like £1.2 billion last year through a whole series of grant incentives, mainly through local authorities, to help the poorest people in society, those who are earning less than 30,000, to do precisely that, to insulate their homes, to insulate their properties, to install low-carbon heating system. Now, by all means, come along and lobby and challenge us and say we should be spending more on it, and this is the problem that the Chancellor will have to face in his spending review. But they cannot say that we're doing nothing, as many of them did say. We are doing a lot in this field. Of course, the other big challenge will be commercial buildings, and there's a range of policies that we'll be consulting on shortly in the heat and building strategy to incentivise the owners of commercial buildings over the National Register, etc., to move slowly over the next 10 to 15 years to more efficient use of buildings and to decarbonising their heating systems as well.
Thanks, Martin. Just to abuse my position for a moment here and just ask you a quick question. You mentioned consumers. I mean, do you think that consumers really, I mean, we know how fraught the politics of energy are. We've seen that on full display even in the last couple of weeks. Do you think that consumers have even really begun to internalise what the sort of changes might be that are coming on the way? And if not, I mean, where do you think the government, what should the government be doing to try and make sure that does happen?
No, I don't think they are, to be honest. And I think this is one of these debates that we have in Westminster, and I work in Westminster now. I come from the northeast. I like to think I'm sort of grounded back in the real world sometimes. I think if you went out and you did one of your famous vox pops on the streets of Newcastle and said to people, are you in favour of net zero? Most people would say, yeah, sounds like a good idea. Climate change, bit of a problem. We need to tackle it.
Well, they might say, what do you mean?
I'm not. They could, of course, yes. I'm not sure they would think it's something that we should be doing, so something the government should be doing to tackle it. If you then switch the question to, well, this is what you need to do personally, which might well cost you money, we'll help you, we'll incentivise you, etc., but ultimately there could be a cost for you, I think you might find that support for that drops off substantially. Once about fuel prices and other things, it seems to me that if our problem is high world gas and oil prices, which it is at the moment, then surely the solution to that is to use less of it. It's got to be a good thing if we can go for the fabric first approach. If we explain to people that the days of us being self-sufficient in energy are now past. We now only supply about 40% of our own gas usage from the North Sea. If we're to reduce our reliance on unstable autocrats in other parts of the world, we need to generate more energy here in the UK. And therefore, if we can do that with renewable energy, and as I said, the cost of wind turbines and solar panels is dropping massively, then surely that should be a good thing. And we'll see, we're having another contract for difference round in December, and it's perfectly possible that the cost of offshore wind will now come in below that of fossil fuels.
Gillian from Citizens Advice.
Sure, I'm going to pick up some of those themes, which Lord Callanan just talked about as well. So Citizens Advice is a national charity that delivers free, confidential and independent advice that helps millions of people find a way forward each year. And we're also the consumer watchdog for energy. And over 1 million energy consumers used our services last year, which gives us pretty unique insights and data into the problems people are facing right now and the challenges they might face when decarbonising their homes. So when you look at the energy market right now, it's in crisis, and we're expecting quite a bit more turbulence to come as well. We've seen people's concerns firsthand about this. So our helpline contacts are up 150% over the last month. We had a huge spike in the number of people coming to our advice page on our website for what to do when your supplier goes bust. And with the price rises, this winter is going to be very hard for a lot of people, particularly people in the lowest incomes or those behind on their bills. But the current crisis we've got right now in the market illustrates a broader problem because it highlights, again, that not everyone's getting a good deal in today's energy market, particularly people on lower incomes, people without digital skills, people in the private rented sector, people in fuel poverty. And all of these groups really need the benefit of the better prices and warmer homes that the transition is going to deliver. And in the face of the sort of cost of living crisis, it's essential that the government takes the steps to build people's trust and ensure that there's ongoing public buy-in for the net zero transition. Because meeting the sort of transition goals will mean big and costly changes to pretty much everyone's home in this country. There's sort of 29 million homes that need some form of retrofitting with energy efficient measures and low carbon heating. And that in itself is a hugely complex infrastructure problem. And it's a once in a generation task. And the good news is that, as we've just discussed, people are willing to make changes to their homes. They support the net zero target, we did some research and it found that 92% of people were willing to make energy efficiency changes and 79% were willing to change to low carbon heat. But over 2/3 of them said that they were going to need some form of advice or financial support to help with that. And right now, people need to know what's coming next for them and what they're going to need to do. So building public trust and confidence is going to be absolutely crucial to ensuring that people can move forward in making those changes. And as well as the sort of cost issue that we've got to address, our research has shown 2 clear barriers to people taking action, and this is again reflected in the sort of advice trends of what we see from people coming to us. Right now, the process is too complicated for people. You've got to research and find the right type of technology for your home. You've got to find a reputable installer. So right now, there's 10 different types of consumer protection schemes for ground source heat pumps. That's way too many. There should be one. There should ideally be one scheme that covers all sorts of energy efficient and low carbon heating schemes. So as a consumer, you're really stuck trying to figure out what's right for you and who do you trust. Things are going wrong too often still. So the process of making adaptations to your home, you can face sort of dodgy installations, the technologies don't work as you expected, and you might experience difficulties if the technology doesn't work. Right now, people have more protections buying a mobile phone contract than when making energy efficiency improvements to their home. So when you think about the sort of complexity of the changes they need to make, the cost, the disruption to people's lives, then that doesn't feel right. And one of the ways we can make this simpler for people is by improving the consumer protections in these markets, because everyone's going to have to make these changes, and you shouldn't have to be a climate expert in order to understand what's needed. And we know that people aren't going to move forward in making the changes, and if it feels too complicated to them, or if they hear, they start hearing horror stories of things going wrong to their friends, their family. And because we've got a sort of cost of living crisis for many, the need for fairness and public legitimacy over the cost of net zero is going to be absolutely crucial. Many people's household finances are under significant strain at the moment. So we need to ensure that the government can take action to avoid the public perception that the costs of net zero are going to be unfairly distributed or unaffordable to many. And the government must absolutely tackle these challenges head on if we're to achieve the climate change goals and realize the benefits. So we'd like to see the upcoming net zero strategy give people the tools and the confidence they need to engage with the transition, providing them with the right information, consumer protection, and the financial support to help them start this journey. And if we get it right, we can give people the confidence they need to future-proof their homes, provide the much-needed certainty for businesses to unleash innovation, to invest in skills, and create good quality green jobs for the future.
Thank you, Gillian. I mean, you're sat next to the minister now. I'm just interested. I mean, you obviously just gave a very comprehensive diagnosis of where we are. I mean, if you were to say, in terms of helping consumers understand this market and make this transition, what's the best thing that government could do in the short term to aid that?
So we need a public engagement campaign that sort of tells people about what's coming down the track with the net zero transition, and gives them a good idea of the choices they're going to have open to them, the sort of timetable for when they'll need to make changes and the routes on which they might do it. They're going to need access to independent advice in order to sort of, because most people, when you think about the sort of how you might start making sort of net zero related changes, most people don't know where to start. Should they replace their boiler now? Should they wait until it breaks? Do they need to improve the energy efficiency of, install insulation? So there's a lot of questions that people are going to have about what's right for their individual property. For people that live in the private rented sector and social housing, those choices will be very different because they're not, they don't have the ability to do that themselves.
At the moment, I suppose you're sort of fulfilling part of that role at the moment, insofar as the best you can.
As best we can. I think there needs to be a much bigger investment in independent advice in order to help people with this journey. And I think the other thing too is there needs to be significant investment in proper redress. So if things go wrong, one of the ways you feel confident as a consumer is if you think you can get your problems sorted out, and there'll be compensation if something incorrect was installed in your home or it doesn't work as planned. So just having that whole sort of package of support will really help people move forward with this.
Gillian, thanks very much. Next up, Josh Buckland from Flint.
Thanks very much, Lewis, and apologies for my tardy arrival. I was going to blame the fact there are a lot of net zero related events at this year's conference, but I really just got lost. Lord Callanan was on the same event as I was just a minute ago, so he was on time and I was late. I'm from a company called Flint.
He actually wasn't.
Oh, there we go. I don't feel too bad. So I'm from a company called Flint Global, but I spent 10 years in government working in the Treasury in Number 10 and in Bays on various energy and climate related issues. So I was going to give you a bit of my view at least, the things that Lord Callanan maybe can't say around kind of some of the challenges government faces in the kind of home decarbonisation journey. It's an absolutely brilliant topic to be discussing at conference. Homes are responsible for a third of the UK's emissions, and it is the bit of decarbonisation that is really difficult. And anyone who's been involved in this sector for a period of time knows that to be true. It's safe to say there is a huge amount of public support for climate action. I don't think that's very kind of irrefutable now. But if you actually look underneath the kind of bones of climate polling, it's very clear that actually people don't necessarily think that means they should take action. Largely, they take the view that government should be leading the way, and to kind of Gillian's point, and also that big businesses should be taking up and sucking up the cost. And that, as we know, when it gets to homes, is nigh on impossible and not necessarily justified. And clearly, home decarbonisation is the biggest political test that government faces over the course of the remainder of this Parliament, and obviously beyond that into the net zero journey. Yes, they made huge progress on transport, on power decarbonisation, but really the political test is going to be whether they can come up with a fair route to decarbonising homes, at least starting the journey over the course of this Parliament. Maybe because I was late, I'll try and be relatively brief, but 3 things I wanted to kind of briefly cover about how I would think about the challenges government faces. Firstly, you can't just rely on public subsidy. Absolutely, there is a role for targeted provision of support, especially for those in low incomes and a lot of the people that Gillian was talking about who need kind of more tailored advice and support. But the cost is significant. You look at the CCC's kind of trajectory, they would say that it's £200 billion plus to decarbonise the UK's heating sector alone. And it's £10,000 plus a home. So realistically, the government can't subsidise everything. You need a mixture of every single intervention that's required, whether that be regulation, tax, yes, targeted subsidy, but also critically, you need the private sector to come up with a technological innovation that will drive down costs. Because ultimately, we're not going to be able to deliver on a trajectory of that cost profile. We're going to need to reduce costs. And the private sector are already doing that. And you've seen what's happened on transport. You've seen the electric vehicles kind of revolution that's come through. That's exactly what needs to happen on the heat side. Secondly, and this just steal what Gillian said, it needs to be simple. It is unbelievably complicated if you're a consumer and you want to look to decarbonise your home currently. Who do you go to? What do you buy? When do you buy it? Who do you get reputable advice from? Who do you go with in terms of kind of installers? That's a complicated enough beast. So if government is going to make any progress, it needs to be a simple, straightforward approach. And previous schemes, the Green Homes Grant, is a good example of some of the challenges that government faces within that. And critically, the schemes need to be joined up. So there's no point installing a heat pump if you don't look at improving the fabric efficiency of a home. And also critically, that advice, and I slightly going to take the view that it's not necessarily only for government to give this advice, it needs to come from reputable sources and people that, and innovative companies that people will believe. Government could never convince you to buy an iPhone. There's no reason they could convince you to buy a heat pump. You really need the companies to be telling that story and giving the opportunity for consumers to engage. And then finally, I think the only way that this works is that people are financially rewarded for the interventions they're making. A lot of people, yes, will take a view that they want to take environmental action. Everyone, I'm sure in this room, recycles. It's small things that we can all do. But in truth, to make a big upgrade to your home, people are going to need to see value at the other end for doing so. So one of the things that I think is really important is to how you can translate investment in low carbon technologies in the home. So for example, heat pumps, whether it be kind of EVs, whatever it may be, and the value comes through to consumer, whether that be in lower energy bills, whether that be principally in home value. There's a really interesting dynamic around could the banks give greater value propositions to decarbonised homes. That's the thing that's going to really change this market. And without that, it's going to be very difficult for people to take the choice. The final thing I would say before concluding is it's really important to remember that this is a 30-year journey. 2050 will come around far too quickly, I'm sure, but we don't need to decarbonise everyone's home tomorrow. And that's why we need to be very careful about forceful boiler bans and kind of tax hikes. We need to think about the very cautious approach to bring people with us on the line that technology will improve over time. And we need to make sure that people understand that it's a journey. And yes, they'll have to take action at some stage, but they're going to be supported to doing so.
You just made a point there that I'm quite interested in myself in the sense of, do you think that sort of precipitous action, I suppose what you're saying is that in the end is retrograde because it convinces people you lose too much support within the public who are instinctively in favour of what you're trying to do?
Exactly. So that's definitely my view. And you look at the transport side, we've now got a phase-out target for electric vehicles, but that's only really become clear at the point where there is cost parity and people can see that there is value in them taking up an electric vehicle and there is support in place. So I'm absolutely supportive of regulation in this space, but it needs to be done at the point that technology is in the right space to avoid undermining public support and trust, which is so unbelievably critical when we're talking about people's homes.
Well, people can definitely see the advantages of an electric vehicle this week, if nothing else. So, last but not least, go to Patrick Hall from where else but Bright Blue.
Thanks very much, Lewis. Sorry, can you hear me? I may be repeating a little bit of what's already been said, but that's the joys of going last. The UK's housing stock is very inefficient, especially compared to our European neighbours. It's responsible for a third of our emissions, and at the moment 19 million homes are below EPC Standard C, which is the minimum standard that the Committee on Climate Change says we need to be at with all of our homes by 2035 at the latest. So we've got a big mountain to climb. We've heard a lot about the merits of decarbonisation. I think there's some other cases you can make for better insulated homes. One is around consumer energy bills, which in a well-insulated home can save up to £400 a year. And the other is a public health case. Better insulated homes can save the NHS £1.4 to £2 billion a year and avoid up to 10,000 deaths. So there's lots of reasons why we want to be doing this. But there are barriers, and we've discussed them today, cost being one, disruption being another, skills shortages for carrying out these retrofits, and unfamiliarity. And on that point, around unfamiliarity, consumer research shows that only a quarter of the public understands what a boiler ban would mean for them, and over half of the public just finds the concept of green homes confusing. So we have a long way to go in terms of enlightening the public and giving them more information about this. But before we consider the government policy that should be implemented to help better insulate and heat our homes with low-carbon technologies, I think we need to take heed of where we've failed so far. And the Green Homes Grant is a good example of that. Had a target of retrofitting 600,000 homes in 6 months. It achieved 10% of that. 86% of people that capitalised on that scheme had a poor experience. So there's lots of reasons why the Green Homes Grant didn't work. It was confusing. You had primary measures and secondary measures. Primary measures including low carbon heat and insulation, secondary including double glazing. I mean, for the layperson trying to navigate this stuff is very difficult. And then secondly, you had supply side issues. So if you got through all that and then you wanted the retrofits to be carried out, it was difficult to find an installer that's accredited, able to install it. Now, why is that? I believe it's because we've had stop-start policy from the government. We've had the Green Homes Grant rolled out. Here it is. It's going to be here for 12 months, or we might get rid of it. Now we're going to extend it for 6 months, and now we've axed it. If you're a business wanting to scale up your supply chain and invest in your staff to ensure that they're accredited to carry out retrofits, you want to be confident that this government policy is here to stay. The businesses didn't have that confidence. They didn't scale up their supply chains, and there you are. You have a shortage of people carrying out those retrofits. And lastly, the Green Homes Grant was poorly administered. It was outsourced to a consultancy based in the United States, gave very confusing advice, and there were issues around installers not receiving payment after they'd carried out the retrofits. So a bit of a disaster. But with that in mind...
apart from that, it was a really good scheme.
but with that in mind, there's lots of policies we can consider now for how best the government can support households to decarbonise. I'd say the first and most important one, in my opinion, is just consistency. No more stop-start policy. People want to see what the policy framework for this is going to look like over the longer term, and I think that will help to resolve the issue around a lack of accredited installers for these retrofits. But there's many other policies that are being mooted. One is the boiler ban. The principle of this is quite similar to the petrol and diesel vehicle phase-out, where you're giving a date and sending a clear signal to the market, and then manufacturers respond, and we've seen that successfully in terms of electric vehicles. The Environmental Audit Committee has also done a big report into the Green Homes Grant, and they've come out with some conclusions. One of them is to use the National Infrastructure Bank to provide low-interest loans for households to be able to retrofit. There have been calls to pump prime a mass market for heat pumps. This is through... there have been calls to fund it through public subsidy, so giving £6,000 to able to pay households, and then for low-income households being able to cover the full cost. So that's one route, and I know that Josh expressed his scepticisms around solely relying on public subsidy, and I would agree with that. And then some other suggestions that have been made is around green stamp duty, which you may have heard, basically offering a rebate on stamp duty if your home is at a certain EPC level and is well insulated. And then lastly, there have been calls to reduce VAT on products and services when it comes to green retrofits. The Environmental Audit Committee, I think, wanted VAT of 5%. Others have called for it just to go to 0% altogether. So they are policies to consider and that are being mooted at the moment. And the final point that I would make is just around the role of local authorities. So the local authority delivery scheme, which is like the baby brother to the Greens Home Grant, is actually regarded as being quite successful and basically just providing capital directly to local authorities to enable them to fund energy efficiency improvements in low-income and energy inefficient households. Devolved retrofits do make sense in a way because local authorities have a deep understanding of their own housing stock. In many instances, they often own it directly, and they also have relationships with local trusted installers. But, there's a lot to debate there. I think we're all awaiting the hotly anticipated heat and building strategy. But in the meantime, I'm sure it'll be an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. I think I should just put it to the Minister. I mean, would you say that you agree with Patrick's assessment that the Green Homes Grant was a, quote, disaster?
It wasn't our finest hour. I've spent the last 6 months trying to sort out the difficulties of the Green Homes Grant. I will say in my defence that I wasn't there in the department when it was...
Of course. Crucially.
I was given it when it had already been established. It hasn't been... we can go into the reasons for it if you want. And I think we've learnt in terms of the schemes that were taken forward. But it was... I agree with his comments that it was over-complex, the secondary and primary and secondary measures was, in retrospect, probably a mistake. The administration was clearly poor. We accepted a tender from a company promising to deliver something who then couldn't. The initial timescales that were fixed for it were overly ambitious. The idea that you could just roll out a £1.5 billion scheme in a matter of months and that the supply chain would automatically scale up to accommodate it was, frankly, probably naive initially.
I'm really straightforward. We don't get that on Newsnight every night, I can tell you. Bim, you just wanted to quickly say something before we go to question.
Yeah, I just...
Told me any old report, actually.
Yeah, well.
I think that the Green Homes Grant not working very well is indicative of our whole problem in this area. We over-specify, over-complicate, don't give the right lead times for the private sector, and then throw up our hands and say, gosh, the private sector says they want to do stuff. They just don't do it. It's like, you can't operate like that in a business. Like, you need clear, simple, broadly based on consensus targets for what you want to do, backed up sometimes by tax incentives, sometimes not. I think the VAT stuff's smart. There are other tax incentives in different areas. But we need to keep things simple and longer term. And actually, if you do that, the market does the rest. And I think as a party, we need to rediscover and remember the value of markets in this sector, just like any other. When we overcomplicate and overspecify, things don't work very well. And so I think that the lesson is not, they're really, really smart people trying to put this together, right? It's not like people didn't know what they were doing or they weren't clever. It's that when you try and do so many micro-interventions, it's very unlikely for it to work in a society like ours. And that's how we need to approach this whole thing, is avoid those mistakes.
Do you think the Conservative Party is in danger of forgetting the value of free markets more generally, Bim?
Well, I think that, on this subject, when we talk about the environment and net zero, what we have to remember is that government is not going to get us there, right? It's ingenuity and innovation and technology and bottom-up approaches that will get us there. The government's job is to show the way, set targets where we need to. I use the electric car as a very, very good example of that. And if we decide that the way we're going to do this is the government telling everybody in a very micro level what they have to do to their house, or here are your 15 options to do this and you've got to pay for them all, and we're sending someone round to do this to you, it is not going to work in our society. Regardless of ideology, that is not going to work. And if we don't realise that, then we'll be sitting here in a few years' time and people will say, well, you guys tried all the environmental stuff, it didn't work. Maybe we should bin the whole thing. And I think that would be a mistake.
Go to Gillian quickly, and then Josh, and then we'll open up to questions. Gillian.
Sure. Yeah, no, I just wanted to... one of the other problems with the Green Home Grant that we certainly found is that there were a lot of scams around it. And I think that just goes back to the need that when we have these markets, emerging markets can experience a number of problems if they're not regulated properly. And that is something the government also needs to be thinking about, because the sort of UK precedent tends to be that we wait until there's a big sort of scandal, there's a lot of consumer detriment. If we look at the opening of the retail market to competition many, many years ago, we had a huge explosion in mis-selling, which, you know, destroyed a lot of people's trust in that market. We're at risk of repeating that with net zero if we don't get the consumer protections right for it.
But can I just make that, what I think is interesting there, so BIM made what I thought was an excellent point, that schemes need to be simple and clear and easy to understand, and I agree with him. But then, of course, you've got Gillian's point, which was if you do that, then you run into scams and shysters who try to take advantage of it. So part of the reason for the complexity in any central government-run scheme is because the Cabinet Office, the Treasury, the bean counters, etc., are all over it, and the lawyers are filling in loads of advice. How can we eliminate every last fraudulent opportunity in it? So you end up then building in more and more system for the installers to validate that the work has been done, because at the end of the day, this is taxpayers' money that we're spending. So every time I try and come up with a way to simplify a system, somebody will come along and say, oh yeah, but the Treasury won't like this because we might lose 5% of it in fraud, and they can picture that entirely, and then the National Audit Office will come in and beat you over the head because you didn't get this right. And so the kind of natural reaction of officials and policymakers is to overcomplicate something, build in more protections, build in more layers of approvals to go through each time, which mitigates against what you want. And I agree with you, which is a simple, clear, something that sort of Mrs. Miggins at 34 Acacia Avenue can understand. But the complexity is sometimes put in for good reasons, and
I agree,
it's a corollary of difficult things to try and do.
I think that, and I have huge sympathy with you, and I've spoken to Kwasi a lot about the Green Homes Grant and various other things as well, and I think that it's exactly this tendency that is the battle that needs to be won on this particular subject. I completely agree, and I completely understand, you know, what you're saying. But unless we can be willing in certain instances to take a little bit of that difficulty in the short term, because actually you find out those things over the medium long term anyway, unless we're willing to do that, then I just don't think we're going to...
The trouble is, I mean, I don't dominate the discussion on this, but I mean, I've done 2 select committees on it in the last couple of weeks, and my permanent secretary and the officials were up in front of the Public Accounts Committee getting roasted because of this. Trying to convince them that they need something simpler with less fraud protections built in, with less hurdles to go through, is difficult in such circumstances when your colleagues quite rightly want to go through in this minute details and nitpick and examine every decision that's taken to overcomplicate something. But it's a difficulty.
Right, well, let's explore this a little bit more with some contributions from the floor. If I could just ask you just to wait until a microphone comes over, because the good thousands of people watching on a live stream won't be able to hear you if not. So if you just say where you are, where you come from, and if I'm looking at my phone as well, we're going to take a few questions from people who are watching, wherever they happen to be, if they're unlucky enough not to be here. So I'm not sort of just being terribly rude and finding you all really boring. I'm just looking at my phone because they're WhatsApping me them. So let's go for the lady down the front here to start with.
Good evening, County Councillor Teresa Heritage. I was just till last year also a district councillor, so I'm supporting Patrick in his plea, look at local government. You have however many authorities there are around the country, upper tier, 153 upper tier, 300 local. You have trading standards around the country who do excellent job, and I'm talking up for Hertfordshire here because I'm county councillor there. Can you not work with local government more closely to deliver this agenda? One of the big issues that I've come up in casework is the retrofitting of air source heat pumps. They are terrifically noisy. So I have residents on either side of them complaining. There's no standard around them, there appears to be. There's nothing in local planning around it. It's not my problem, so I'm not going to look at it, says the officer. So you need to look at building control. That makes life a little bit easier and more acceptable. So also, EV charging, and it's not what you're necessarily talking about, but at the county council, local residents are looking at us to fit charging on every lamppost. Not logical. But there isn't anything out there coming from Central or anywhere, even businesses, about how we're going to deliver that. People seem to think that it's got to be outside their house, whereas at the moment they go to the petrol pump. So I just make those comments.
Thank you very much. Maybe take a couple more. The lady behind as well, since the microphone is there.
Actually, do you mind if I don't use the microphone? So I've got quite a booming voice.
Well, I have been instructed that it's necessary, but if you really boom, then maybe they'll hear you, from wherever people are.
Something that people always comment on. I actually represent the non-combustible insulation manufacturers. So I can...
As opposed to the combustible insulation manufacturers.
Yes.
Who are presumably out of business now.
They're very popular, aren't they?
Well, of course, it's a huge differential. Who would want combustible products on their buildings? Anyway, I won't comment about that further. Obviously, the government's committed to 78% carbon reduction. Homes are 23% of that, and 60% of that 23% are homeowners. There's absolutely nothing to address homeowners. Obviously, we had the Green Homes Grant, and I'm not going to linger on that, because from an industry perspective, we didn't want to touch it with a barge pole. However, we do want to see a sustainable market, a sustainable supply chain, and we have put through, we have an organisation called the Energy Efficiency Infrastructure Group. You may have heard of them, you may have not, and we are a broad church of organisations that campaign on this very issue. And we've actually put together a Better Buildings investment plan to show you how to do that, because we need to piece all the pieces of the jigsaw together for government, very aware that money is an issue. And we very much firmly support, as part of our plan, a green stamp duty. A green stamp duty basically is revenue neutral. It allows funding to be directed to those who need it most. And it rewards the consumers for actually upgrading their homes, or within 2 years when they move to a new property, of upgrading their homes. It's a very, very simple mechanism. We have a stamp duty calculator, and you'll be able to see that on our website.
Could I trouble you for a question if you've got one, madam, at this point?
But we would, we would like government to obviously take this seriously. I know Treasury is the one that needs to stump up the funding and support for this, but we would really appreciate Bayes' support on this as well.
Well, that was some fun, first-class lobbying if I've ever seen. and then just one more, maybe from the gentleman at the front here. If you have a question at the start, that would be absolutely marvellous.
I'm Alistair Harper from Shelter. Bim mentioned bringing forward the Future Home Standard, and that would be awesome. But we've heard the issue is the supply chain. Things aren't there, the businesses aren't there to deliver it. So my question for the Minister especially is, can we prime the heat pump with some investment in new build, net zero, social housing homes across the country? We get ready through deployment, build those supply chains up, and do it equitably, build the social homes that we're losing every year.
Great, okay, well, why don't we start? Who would like to kick off about local government, the importance of local governments?
Actually, totally agree. And I think Josh said that in his contribution, that whilst the Green Homes Grant Voucher Scheme was not our finest hour, to put it mildly, the bit that has worked well is the local authority delivery scheme, and following on from the home upgrade grant, where currently in the final phase of distributing another 300 million to local authorities, which should be announced in the next couple of weeks, that have all bid into the grant scheme. And it's actually been a huge success. The first 3 rounds of funding have gone extremely well, and we're building on that precisely for the reasons that you identified, that local authorities know their patches better than we in central government do. The schemes required in rural Hertfordshire are completely different to inner city Tyneside, different solutions, different areas. So yes, we're proposing to continue that. We will do that in the latest round of funding. The lady about the brilliant lobbying for the non-combustible insulation manufacturers.
David Cameron, eat your heart out, frankly.
We all know the difficulties that combustible insulation has caused. And actually there's a very serious point about the bad reputation that cladding or external wall insulation, as we now call it, has got because of the terrible events in Grenfell. But actually, there's some really good innovative products, plug for the industry here, going on there. I went to visit one of the LAD schemes that we were doing in County Durham, and the improvements that the CWI had provided to a street of really run-down Victorian terraced housing is incredible. The residents were delighted with it. It really improved the look of the whole thing, because you can now make it so that it actually looks like brick or like stone on the final finish. And it's a really cost-effective solution, provides a huge uplift in value for these properties, and really improves the look of the whole village. So I agree with you there. The question, of course, is how we pay for it, and that's happily one for the Chancellor to address in his spending review. Gentleman from Shelter seems to be turning up at all these meetings asking the same question for some strange reason. Not my responsibility, the funding for social homes, but certainly in terms of decarbonising them, then the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which we're committed to spend £3.8 billion over the next 10 years, is an excellent scheme. We've done the first 2 rounds of that, and it's been extremely successful. By all means, lobby for more to be spent, but that's for the Chancellor to decide.
A question that has just been sent to me from our viewers online is, has the development of the green homes market been adversely affected by the loss of several energy companies last month, which has pushed up the bills for many? I mean, I'm interested to hear from the panel whether you think that the sort of current events more generally just do not bode well for the development of this agenda.
I guess it comes back slightly to the question around kind of consumers are very different. If you're a kind of fuel poor household and you're facing rising gas bills, your ability and willingness to take action is even more reduced in the event that you're now facing an affordability crisis. So I think it's really hard to see it as a kind of uniform thing. On the counterbalance, obviously, there are consumers who may see then there's an opportunity now, if they've got the ability to spend the money themselves, to be looking to get out of gas, because ultimately that is obviously now kind of pressing. So it really does depend on the kind of consumer. I think there is a challenge. Obviously, kind of companies going bust always undermines trust, and ultimately then does potentially impact their ability and willingness to take the plunge with an energy supplier who will be critical for understanding and making progress in decarbonising your home. So it clearly will have a short-term impact. The critical question for government is how you build a sustainable retail market in the long term that ensures that those companies can innovate. Because ultimately, if you're a retailer, you essentially own the interface with the consumer. So you are the one who is giving them the tariff, giving them the smart meter, giving them the EV charger, whatever it may be. So that linkage is going to be absolutely critical. And it's safe to say that kind of near term, it's like chaos in the retail market probably doesn't help that.
Any more questions from the gentleman at the back there? Very speedily raised his hand.
I'll stand up because I am right at the back here. Howard Ward, Winchester constituency. I was also recently retired Energy Services Director of a business-to-business consultancy with about 100 consultants on it, and I was an ESOS lead assessor from day one of the first phase of the scheme. So I like to believe that I know a little bit about energy. Picking up on some of the things there, you said, are you going too quickly with some of this? I would have to sort of agree with that and ask why that is. Because we've had a lot of meetings here today on energy in there, and yet not once have I ever heard someone talk about the payback of it. It's almost as if we've got this sort of quasi-religion that we have to do and go for this greening of it there without any real professional approach to it. So can we also actually look at some serious professional energy saving measures and put that into the mix? Another quick side one there. You mentioned about all the scams that were going on in the first opening up of the energy market, and I tell you that I think that's all to the utterly uselessness of Ofgem on there. And I've got lots of stories of that, and offline, happy to take it with anybody. Just
let's not do too many of them now.
Why they did the backside?
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Gentleman down here.
I'm David Blackman, representing Utility Week magazine. Just a couple of questions. First of all, to BIM, I'd be interested to get your observations on perhaps the rejoinder to your argument that the market is the best way to deal with this, with the net zero transition, is the very success of the local authority delivery scheme, which the panel's been talking about tonight. Also, sort of picking up on Patrick's points earlier about sort of how we finance this. I was wondering if any of the panelists would like to discuss the perhaps role the role that perhaps the green gilts could play in this. I think that issuance seems to have gone more successfully than people anticipated. So, is there a way of translating that source of finance through to the kind of the micro level of individual consumers? Thank you.
And just one more, perhaps a gentleman here in the pink shirt.
So the question would be, how valuable do you think the planning process is in delivering these changes? The reason I ask that is I sit on the Construction Leadership Council for small and medium-sized house builders, and I actually advised BEIS throughout the whole Green Homes Grant process. I warned about all the concerns. I might probably get myself chucked off the working group now, but you were told exactly what the issue was. I actually think the Green Homes Grant was a useful scheme because it identified the MCS installers, so that's the guys that do energy works, and they did a great job, and we saw there were so many of them. Where there was no installers were the insulation, your windows, your doors, the really important parts to actually make heat pumps work. So that's why, to me, you've already got the solution. No one's mentioned it. Patrick, you did a fantastic job identifying the issues. The National Retrofit Strategy. Now, it asks for a lot of money, but the key components are the policy elements. I wrote the policy elements, so I'm going to say that. But if you look, what they do is they enable the pipeline of work. So how important do you feel the planning policy elements are? That is my question.
Excellent. All right. Ben, why don't you address the first and second question there? First of all, around, is this, to use a gentleman's word, a quasi-religion around greening, but also obviously the question that was put to you directly by a gentleman here about the market always being the best way to deliver this.
Yeah, I think that the difference between religion and another form of belief is that religion relies on faith, and other forms of belief hopefully rely on evidence. And I think that in relation to the green agenda, broadly speaking, there is a lot of evidence. But your point is correct insofar as things need to be financially and economically viable for the individual. And Rachel Wolfe, who's a great friend of mine who runs Public First, has done a huge amount of work, polling work on this and focus groups. And she's done, the report is published. I'd urge all of you to read it because it really talks about how the way in which we talk about this subject, we talk about green homes or green grants or green jobs, and people think, no, don't fancy that. You actually say to people, this will save you money on your bills. Okay, I'm interested. This will make your home warmer. Okay, I'm interested. That's what we need to focus on. So in that respect, I think you're completely right, because unless this works for people in their actual lives, no amount of quasi-religion is gonna solve that. In relation to the point around the private sector and the local authority delivery, I think this is really about the appropriate roles for government and the private sector, right? So, and I'm not just agreeing with her because she's my former constituency chairman in Hertfordshire, but the point that Theresa Heritage made about the local authority being such good at delivery partners is evidenced, actually, I'm going to bring us back to COVID. When we were doing the contact tracing, when it came to the vaccination rollout, working with people in local areas who know the areas almost always does better than the best designed government scheme, because there are just so many, and Lord Callanan made the similar point. So we should partner with local authorities very much. However, in relation to what they're actually installing or what they're actually putting in, that is a role for the private sector in innovation and technology. So it's really about the delineation and the appropriate delineation of government, central government, local government, and the private sector. And it's about getting those right.
And does anyone have anything particularly insightful to say to this gentleman's question around the planning process?
I have nothing.
You have nothing insightful to say? Again, admirable honesty. No one. Goodness gracious. Well, I'm going to have to leave. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to have to.
I mean, planning is an important part of the process, but actually building regulations are probably more. I don't know whether you want to include building regulations within planning or not. But yes, we getting the right buildings in the right place at the right standards is crucial to build.
Something insightful. Oh yeah. Okay. Go on.
I'm going to ask you a question because I really don't know. But I've got a listed house, right? The rules around listing, as you know, with planning, very complex. What is the current working sort of plan for the hundreds of thousands of listed buildings we have in the country in relation to dealing with this? Because I would guess that in the EPC ratings, that's where they're right at the bottom. So how do people think we can deal with this?
So we've got around 7.8 million homes that are single brick, single skin. We have around 1.8 million homes in conservation areas. So you've already got two parts of homes there that are very difficult to insulate. Can't do EWI on them, external wall insulation, because nobody likes the look of them. You can do the sides perhaps and maybe the back, but not the front, which is the important part. I mean, the whole part is important, but the front is really important because it has the greatest exposure. So if you say do a VAT reduction to 5% on all homes, you'll find that for people like yourself, you will get the worst materials, or perhaps poor custodians of good homes, not saying you are, but will not do good works on those homes. They won't use the lime plaster. So if you want a strategic approach, if you have just a 5% across everything, people are not going to be incentivized to do the best work. So if you work with Heritage, English Heritage, and with the Heritage Alliance to identify the works that should be done, do the 5% on works and materials, you'll establish a better approach and better market forces to deliver this work. You'll also train the workforce, and you get local authorities to go, hey, maybe we can do this. And that's why within the National Retrofit Strategy, it's in there as trials so that we can actually decouple some of these planning policy issues. But if you want to do any works on listed buildings or anything like this, or the 7 million homes, good God, is it expensive? And I represent the builders, and who do the consumers ask? The builders. And they go, got two choices. I can do this, line your insulation in your roof, really easy, or we can go through this long process, get yourself planning permission, then probably get it knocked back, then all the costs, and that takes 7 to 8 months, and it's really expensive. And they go, I'll go for the first option. The government's got a great policy coming through now with the street voting, because if we can get mansard roofs up, we can make more energy efficient roofs automatically, and that's going to be great. But more of these simplistic planning policy solutions, but it requires the government to be brave and go, actually, energy efficiency is more important than a building that people think looks historical. And I know that's a tough, exactly, the face is pulled. And that's why planning is important, because it's not just planning permissions, it's policy elements.
Very interesting. Other questions from the room? This gentleman here.
Hi, this is going to be a naive question because I'm not from the industry and a member of the public. So my question is, why does energy efficiency of the building matter as much if the key goal is to get to carbon zero, and clearly energy efficiency as a percentage of that isn't as important as getting everybody onto electrification of heating, and then from there simply cleaning up, getting the grid on zero carbon. Isn't that it? So what am I missing?
Well, only that it will be more expensive because you'll use more energy. Heat pumps generally are a good technology, but they provide water at a lower temperature generally than gas boilers do. Therefore, you need bigger heat emitters, and you don't want to waste the heat that you're producing from them, because they're not as efficient in terms of producing clean, simple heat.
But then surely from economic freedom.
But if you don't care about the cost, then obviously.
From an economic freedom point of view, if it's going to cost someone more to have that energy, then they've got the economic freedom to sort out. We've got to carbon zero, and now let the people sort out how they reduce their costs.
I think there's also system security issue. So if you look at kind of no energy efficiency scenarios and kind of mass kind of heat and flexibility scenarios, the amount of grid infrastructure, the amount of electricity power stations you've got to build is enormous, and that's kind of a system-wide issue. So irrespective of kind of just the specific kind of cost to the household, there's a system-wide cost which potentially stretches the kind of bounds of reality for how many renewables you can build, how much nuclear, how much CCS you can build, and that's the other challenge that sits behind it. Because obviously, if there is energy efficiency plays a critical role in reducing that level of system demand.
Isn't that going to be noise compared to electrification that's going to happen once we have all our cars on electric energy?
Actually, the heating load is significant. The heating load is a massive proportion. So we have 3 times as much heating energy requirement than electricity at the moment. So it's a really significant chunk.
And it's less flexible because with electric vehicles, there's going to be a lot of smart chargers that will reduce demand on the grid at peak hours. So
every day's a school day, isn't it?
I think the other thing too to think about is sort of, we've got a lot of cold, leaky homes in this country which aren't as comfortable to live in. If you've ever lived in an energy efficient home, it is just simply more comfortable. So if we're sort of doing the process of installing low carbon heat, we might as well improve the efficiency of our homes just so they're just nicer to live in.
Well, Stephen has messaged in. Hello, Stephen. Saying first time caller. Saying, is it time to be honest about the fact that for some, decarbonising social housing or all housing will raise energy costs, at least in the short term? Minister.
Well, actually, the evidence doesn't suggest that. You have to decarbonise a home, particularly the fabric first, then you can end up with significantly lower bills, even if it's a different bill. So, I mean, if you electrify the heat and you insulate something really well, then you can end up with lower bills. The problem, of course, is that it's the landlord or the council that are bearing the initial capital cost of doing the work, but the tenant gets the benefit in terms of lower bills.
Gillian, do you think that, from your impression of citizens' advice, in terms of most people, do you think assume that greening is going to cost them money?
I think most people assume that greening is going to cost them money, which is why it's really important that the government comes forward with a proper package of financial support for people to help with this, whether that's grants for certain households, whether that's low-cost loans for others, whether that's just sort of green mortgages. There's going to need to be a range of options for the range of different household financial circumstances.
It goes back to the point that the gentleman at the back made about payback and incentives, isn't it? You've got to provide people with the right incentives to make the change, which you can do by adjusting policy levers. So, for instance, the biggest challenge we face is adjusting the differential in cost between gas and electricity. At the moment, we have a lot of extra green on costs onto electricity resulting from the decarbonisation of the electricity supply, but very little on gas, only the green gas support scheme. We need to, how shall I put it, rebalance those prices.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Lady down here.
Sorry, Emma Gann.
Will you just wait for the microphone if you wouldn't mind?
Sorry, Emma Gann from The Telegraph. But on that point about rebalancing the costs, if you rebalance the levies and just switch them, you end up with vanishingly few customers who are going to be paying the burden of the social and environmental levies that we pay, all of us now pay on our electricity.
Well, of course, a lot of them are temporary because they are incentives provided to wind farm operators, for instance, that last for a period of years of price support. But the new ones that are coming on stream now are significantly cheaper, and the contract for difference round that we're having in December will hopefully produce actually prices that are below that of fossil fuels. So over time, those costs will disappear from the bills. But yeah, I mean, to persuade people to make the change, we have to provide them with the right incentives. And at the moment, in most circumstances, if you are on mains gas, it makes sense to put a mains gas boiler in as opposed to a heat pump because of the differential in cost. So you've got to provide people with the right incentives in order to do that. But it's a difficult policy challenge, but happily it's one for the Treasury and not for me.
I was just going to come back on that because I think the only way you can really do it is if you are going to do a rebalance policy cost is to basically take them off the electricity bill, because I'm an electricity only household, and why on earth should I be able to skip those costs and put them onto the 85% of homes that are on the gas side of the network at the moment? That doesn't feel right, given the costs are largely with clean electricity production. So I get the benefit but not the cost. So in truth, if there is going to be a change in policy costs, the most obvious thing to do would be to pull them off the electricity bill completely and put them into either general taxation or another form of subsidy support.
Gentleman here, assuming you still have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. No, please.
So Dan Meredith for E.ON. As you know, we've done a lot of energy efficiency and lab schemes, which is great. But before that, we helped take wind farms, particularly, and solar panels from being niche, expensive, small-scale things to very large, very cheap things. And you talked earlier about that balance between having some kind of certainty for the industry, who I'm speaking for, so we know that we can invest and we get the skills in place and we invest in people. But you're also saying that we don't want to spook people, so we don't want to go too quickly, we don't want to... So there's a balance there, because how do you get the industry to know and believe this is a long-term project that is definitely not going to go away if we switch governments or if we flip-flop from policy to policy over the next 10 to 15 years, but you don't move people along too soon or spook them into things? So, you know, the boiler ban being one example. How do you get that balance right? What policies work, what policies don't?
Patrick, this is exactly what you were talking about stop-start.
Well, I think when the heat and building strategy is released, what we want to see is just policy that's consistent. I haven't advocated for a specific policy tonight. I've advocated for consistency. I think, too, I just wanted to pick up another point. Was it someone here who made the point around the energy crisis and what the impact that has on public support for decarbonising home heating. I think that when we look at that, we need to identify who that's going to hit the hardest. And I think that the most morally and fiscally responsible thing to do would be to provide targeted support to the fuel-poor households. I think that should be done through the Warm Homes discount, because at the moment that's providing £140 a year in support. I think that should be increased to help homes get through a tough winter, to help fuel-poor households get through a tough winter. But I also hear a lot of people saying that this energy crisis, or specifically wholesale gas prices, is somehow an argument for us to go further down the route of fossil fuels and to solidify and commit to gas as a form of home heating. And I think actually, really, it's making the case that we need to be shifting to electrification backed up by renewables powered here in the UK. So I just wanted to come back to that point while I had the microphone. Thank you.
Well, you can keep the microphone, because I've got a question here from James saying that if each panel member could pass only one policy which they found would be the most advantageous, don't laugh in the room, James is listening, most advantageous in decreasing carbon emissions by the UK housing stock, what would it be? Patrick.
I think...
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I think green stamp duty.
That lobbying was fantastic. It really worked.
I think you've got to make electricity cheaper. I think all the analysis you look at shows that electricity is going to play the most critical role in decarbonisation. So the critical thing government should do is think about, and this is not necessarily just Bayes' and Lord Callahan's challenge, how it can ensure that electricity is affordable, because then households can make an economic decision, and private sector companies and banks can ultimately finance it for them.
Bim?
Probably 0% VAT for those homes that are below a certain rating on the EPC for housing.
Gillian?
I think I'm going to have to agree with Josh and go with making electricity cheaper.
And of course, last but not least,
I'm afraid I'm going to avoid the question and say I don't think I don't think there is one silver bullet. As I think it was John Kerry, wasn't it, that said silver buckshot rather than silver bullet. There's lots of different interventions that we can make across a whole range of green finance, pump priming of pump expenditure, etc. Yes, helping fuel poor.
But if there was one, if there was just one.
Rebalancing gas and electricity costs is quite important.
There we are. The lady there.
Thanks very much. Alex Joseph. Two questions, if I may. The first one is levies on gas versus electricity. Do you think that the Conservative Party needs to grasp a nettle and levy gas in some way, even though that could have implications for fuel poverty and that sort of issue, but to encourage people towards electricity? And part two is hydrogen. Do you think there is a role for hydrogen on a perhaps interim basis, or maybe not on an interim basis, to help with this issue as well?
Okay, let's get this out of the way. Hydrogen. Again, I'm interested in all of the panel's views. I mean, just briefly, hydrogen, what role do you think it's going to play? Minister?
I think it will be significant, but I don't think we know yet how significant it will be. So we have the hydrogen strategy we produced in August, targeting 5 gigawatts of low-carbon hydrogen. There are two types of hydrogen, blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is from electrolysis. So if you use renewable electricity, it's fairly carbon-free. Blue hydrogen you produce from methane gas, storing the carbon dioxide, so it's not as carbon-free. So we need to, again, approach it the same way we've approached wind farms and other things, and provide the appropriate price support mechanism to pump prime the market. And I think the jury is still out, genuinely, in terms of how much the cost will fall. It will fall, but will it fall enough? I think, if I'm being honest, the idea that we could produce enough hydrogen at reasonable cost to displace mains gas, I think, is pretty much impossible. I mean, technology might get us there. There might be some fantastic scientific breakthroughs. I think it's more likely that hydrogen will end up being used for trains, for heavy goods vehicles, for some industrial processes, rather than for home heating. But the official policy is that we will see how the market develops and take a view in the mid part of this decade in terms of whether it will have a significant role to play in home heating or not.
Patrick, do you agree?
Well, I think Caden Gas is doing a trial up north where they're basically running hydrogen through the grid to 250 houses at a blend of 20%. And when you do that, you don't have to make any changes to existing infrastructure. So, in fact, the consumers that were part of the trial virtually didn't even know that it was happening.
You still have to reduce the hydrogen, though.
Yes, but in terms of the convenience of the heating for the consumers, virtually no changes are having to be made. Having said that, I'm of a view that we shouldn't really be picking a winner at this point. I think that we should be looking at all technologies, heat pumps and hydrogen. I don't like the debate of we have to pick one or the other. At this stage, I think we should keep all options on the table. One may prevail, but I think that's a more sensible approach.
Madam, forgive me, your first question, I guess, escaped me momentarily.
Thanks. It was looking at the levies on gas versus electricity.
We have started a green gas levy, which will start next year, but I think you've got to recognise the politics of this, and I think the opportunity for politicians to know at the moment when gas prices are going through the roof and telling people we are imposing additional levies on gas is pretty much nigh on impossible politically.
Courageous, Minister.
Very courageous.
Very courageous. Any other questions? You have asked one already, sir. So, is there anybody else? We're coming towards the end in any case, but all right. Well, since no one else, since we get a bonus ball for the back
question.
there. Yeah.
Thank you. Just picking up on something someone said there. Need to make, or two of you I think said, need to make electricity cheaper. How are you going to do that? I mean, bear in mind that it's not a primary fuel, so there's lots of inefficiencies with it. Bear in mind also that what happened last winter when we were trying to get lots of wind energy down from the northwest coast of Scotland down to where people actually live and where they can use it, and they all had to be constrained off when the Western Link went down, and that actually was very expensive. And without that open-ended subsidy, those so-called green wind farms would never have been built. So there's a massive subsidy on the green there. So how are you going to make it cheaper?
So I used to think in this way on this subject until I read and taught and understood more around local electricity markets. The difficulty with how renewable energy works, as you know, as you made the point very well, you've got wind in Orkney, and they're trying to get it to Hertfordshire. There is a huge amount of inefficiency with that. It doesn't work very well. But if you could, in your local area, have local pricing of electricity, that's partly an infrastructural thing, but it's as much a regulatory and a legal question. If you can do that, then actually what you'll end up doing is you'll use your energy much more effectively in different parts of the country.
Yes, but it's also going to be less reliable. It's also going to be less reliable and more susceptible, perhaps on a smaller scale, to the transmission system going down.
Well, it depends what you're talking about, right? So if you're talking about wind in a balmy August day, then yes. But if you've got nuclear, well, it's not. And throughout most of the year, wind is actually pretty reliable. Solar in this country, not going to be a huge contributor, but it's not going to be irrelevant in summertime. So it sort of depends what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely. I think that model works on the requirement that you have additional electricity storage within the system, because if you can store electricity, especially cheap, zero marginal cost of renewable electricity over a longer period of time than just a couple of hours, that's potentially a game changer in terms of accessing that cheap electricity. The other thing to remember is that around about 50% of the electricity bill, the electricity price that consumers pay is fixed cost, which does not relate to the wholesale cost. So that's where you can make the point around, can you take off the levies of the electricity side to reduce the overall electricity price that consumers pay? Because at the moment, and this comes back to the point that was made around the work that some of, I think, Public First have done, actually that ongoing cost dynamic really reduces the upfront incentive for consumers to take up the electric option.
Mm-hmm. But you have to do it in a very careful way, because there's a lot of households out there that can't respond to any sort of stimulus. If you're sort of going to do a straight swap from electricity to gas, you're going to disadvantage a huge amount of households, particularly anyone living in the private rented sector, because they're going to be dependent on their landlord responding to those incentives. And that's probably going to be a much longer time coming. So that's just got to be done very carefully, otherwise it's going to get very political.
Any final questions? All right, well, go on then, since it's Sunday. Yeah.
So back to planning policy. We've done brilliantly offshore wind, and I think the contract for difference scheme is it was amazing. Now, onshore wind, onshore renewables, subsidy free in many cases, and I think the government does not get enough credit for what it's done there and the brilliant work to do offshore. There's a reason we don't have onshore, and it's planning policy. And I know the government is scared to commit to it because I have to harangue ministers and ask them about this. So, do you think there should be a change of planning policy to deliver onshore renewables like turbines? Because I know my members, my house builders, would be quite happy to do those sort of works instead of the add-ons. I know it's a tough question, but I think it's one that needs to be out there.
So do you, Minister?
I'm supportive of offshore wind. I think it's... I was a sceptical for years, I think pretty much what Ben was saying, in terms of the contribution that wind would make, particularly some of the lower wattage onshore wind, because of course it's intermittent, you've got to have the backup associated with it. But I think offshore wind has been an absolute game changer. I mean, credit to the business and industry, the way that they have delivered it, and the cost has fallen dramatically. And as I said, we'll see what the results of the next CFD round are in December. But it's likely that the costs will come in below that of fossil fuels. So why would you want to cause lots of hassle and disruption by building more onshore wind if you can get it offshore? Having said that, we are including onshore in the next CFD round, but you'll still have to comply with planning policies.
I think that's
Consent
a no.
of local residents.
Any final thoughts from the panel before we wrap up?
I just take on that point. I lived and breathed the kind of 2015 planning crises in Downing Street at the time. It wasn't an easy period in onshore wind, but it does show, and this comes back to the point on homes. You need to take the public with you, because ultimately the reason that happened was because of local community opposition to individual projects that were not dealt with very well at the time. So if we're going to take that learning and apply it to homes, you've got to take it with you, you've got to do it in a coherent way, and you've got to do it over time rather than forcing people to do stuff they don't necessarily want to do. That's exactly the exact advantage that we've got here.
Marvellous. Excellent. Well, with that, I'd just like to thank the panel. It was a really, really interesting discussion. I've learned what blue hydrogen is. It's not just a cocktail. And that was Labour Party conference, yeah, exactly. That's red hydrogen. Yeah, got it. But yeah, it was really, really interesting discussion. Obviously going to be enormous, as I said at the beginning, enormous part of our politics over the years to come. So again, thank you very much for this panel. Thanks for all of those watching at home, and thanks to all of you for coming as well. Thank you very much indeed.